Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Seed Gathering Masterclass. We are delighted that so many of you could join us today to explore the fascinating topic of growing trees from seed. A very special welcome to our Tree Council supporters and our volunteer tree wardens. My name is Juliette Colaco and I'm National Schools Programme Officer at the Tree Council. Joining me today is my colleague Dom Quinn, who's our Comms and Policy Officer working behind the scenes, and Jon Stokes, who I'll introduce properly later. We'll start with an introduction to the Tree Council, and then we'll explore the incredible diversity of tree seeds and learn how to collect and process your seed to grow your own trees. Finally, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So throughout the masterclass, please put any questions that you have into the Q&A function. For those of you that are new to the Tree Council, we are a national charity that brings everyone together for the love of trees. The charity funds, plants and cares for trees, orchards and hedgerows with the help of volunteers and through its community grant schemes. We inspire the next generation of young environmentalists through our National Schools Programme. We use practical science and research to influence policy and support best practice in trees and the environment. We harness the power of partnership, working with the charity's 100 or so member organisations to help create a healthy, tree-filled future for the planet. The Tree Council offers guidance for action through community-focused seasonal campaigns. The 5 main campaigns held over the year are as follows. Seed Gathering Season, our current campaign, a month-long celebration in the autumn to inspire local communities and families to gather seed, fruits and nuts, and to sow, nurture and help grow the trees for the future. National Tree Week. Each year, upward of 250,000 people don their boots and gloves and come together to plant trees. The Tree Care campaign runs from March to September, and this is the time of year to focus people's attention on the need for better care for all trees to ensure the maximum number survive and reach maturity. Walk in the Woods. During the month of May, this campaign encourages people across the country to celebrate their local trees by getting out into the woods, their local park, or the tree-lined streets of their towns and cities. And finally, National Hedgerow Week. This ran for the first time this May, aiming to get people to talk to the hedge and learn more about the wonders of hedgerows. For this masterclass, as part of Seed Gathering Season, I am delighted to welcome my colleague, Jon Stokes, the Tree Council's Director of Trees, Science and Research, and the author of the Good Seed Guide. Jon is going to take us through the practice of growing trees from seed. So welcome, Jon, and over to you.
Thank you, Juliette, and hello, everybody. So we're going to talk through how you can grow trees from seeds. And as you can see from the picture on the screen, there are a huge range of different shapes, sizes, and types of fruit and seed out there in the countryside at this moment in time. So what we're going to talk through is how you deal with all these different fruits, how you give the opportunity for them to grow into young trees. And we're going to start with a bit of biology of how we get to the fruit in the first place. So it all starts with a seed. Any seed, all seeds are composed of various elements. There's the dormant embryo, the baby tree, which is inside the seed. There's a seed coat that wraps around that baby embryo that protects it from the winter, from cold, from frost. There's a little bit of food of varying sizes in each seed. Some have lots to get them started, some have very little. And they have cotyledons, which are these seed leaves, which are often expressed in the spring as little leaves that help the tree to get started. And possibly the one you've all noticed most of that is the beech. And you can see the little picture at the bottom with the 2 slightly strange leaves that come up in early spring. Well, these are the cotyledons, the seed leaves that help the tree to get started. But to get to a seed, you have to have a flower. And a flower is important because every tree has a flower. It's just we don't always notice them. We're not always aware of them. And there are 2 basic types of tree in the British countryside. There are monoecious trees and dioecious trees. It's probably easiest to think of it as monoecious trees, you need 1 tree. Dioecious trees, you need 2. So on a monoecious tree, there are both male and female flowers. And this hazel catkin, and hazel is a species that's monoecious. This hazel catkin is the male flower. And then there's a little tiny, if you look closely at the top of the photograph where Juliette's put the circle, you can see a little tiny pink flower. That's the female flower. So the hazel blows in the wind. The male produces lots of pollen. The pollen blows away and spreads, as this birch is doing, on the wind to try and locate the female flowers on another tree. To avoid self-pollination, monoecious trees, often their flowers come out at slightly different times. So the male and the female come out at slightly different times. So you have a relatively long season with the trees trying to pollinate each other as the wind blows. So those are monoecious trees. And then there are the other sort of monoecious trees, the ones where the flower is, both the male and female parts of the flower are in one flower, is like this cherry here, or this blackthorn, which is where you have the male and female parts within the one flower. So here the anther, the male part, the stigma, the female part, are contained within the one flower. And these sorts of trees, the distribution mechanism for the pollen is not the wind, but is usually an insect. So the insect flies in, gathers the seed, gathers the pollen as it flies between the trees, it transfers, and then we get into the fact that the plants get pollinated. And if you thought I was rushing then, that was because at that exact moment while we started, there was a minor heavens open. So it has been pouring down in rain, and I thought we might be about to get wet, but fortunately it's just stopped and the sun's come out, so I might be able to relax a bit more. Dioecious trees, the other sort of trees, are where you have to have two. And in holly trees, there are male trees and there are female trees. They're separate. And the pollen has to get from one to the other. And we're often asked, why has my holly not produced berries? Well, it's quite likely that it's a male tree. It was never going to produce berries. Or it could be a female tree and there simply isn't a male one anywhere nearby to pollinate. So monoecious, dioecious, two types of flower on one tree, single flowers on one tree, all of that matters because that's how you get to the place where you produce the seed. Now the seed, as we said at the beginning, is in a whole range of types. There are nuts and cones and wing seeds and fleshy fruits. And we were looking at ways to try and articulate these differences, and we came up with these four broad categories. And these four broad categories enable us to describe a process that we'll talk about in a minute of how you process these seeds to get them ready to grow on your new trees. But fleshy fruits, berries, wing seeds, what we used to call helicopters when I was a kid, cones are obvious, and nuts, things like walnuts, hazelnuts, they're all different types of seed and they all require slightly different processes. And there are others out there in the countryside, but we haven't gone into those too much today because they're in the minority. So berries, fleshy fruits, the things that are obvious at this time of year, things like yew berries, hawthorn berries, rowan berries, they're all out there. And to help you with identification, we have produced a seed ID chart that will be emailed to you or is available on our website, where we've found many of these fruits that you might find, just to help you to understand what you've got, what's out there at the moment in your locality. Because tree seed can be anywhere from town to country, length and breadth of the country. There will be a tree near you that has produced some sort of seed, and berries are the obvious ones. Wing seeds are the next category. And the three on the screen represent the three commonest ones that you might find out in the countryside or in towns or parks. The ash, which has a single wing seed, and then a sycamore and the field maple, which have seeds at a slightly different angles. So in sycamore, the seeds are at a fairly tight angle, whereas in field maple, the seeds are in a straight line. And again, we'll talk about how you process them, but once you've identified they're a wing seed, it's a fairly simple process to move forward. Nuts. Nuts are obvious, many of them. Horse chestnuts, walnuts, hazelnuts. The big fruits that that are there with lots of food stored within them to help the young trees to start growing in the spring. And these types of nuts are often dispersed by animals who take the fruit and bury them and then forget where they are. And that's often how the seeds get dispersed. And we include acorns. They're not technically nuts, but we include acorns in this process because it's about how you process them to get them to grow. So nuts is a big group. And then the last group are cones. There is one broadleaf conifer, or cone producing tree, which is the older, but most of the cones are on the true conifers. And we will talk about how you process. This is the most complex to think about, but actually one of the easiest once you get it right. So those are our 4 types of cones, seeds. And we've produced some guidance. It's on our website on how to find this. And as I say, it will be emailed to you afterwards, but the types of seeds and how you can grow them so that you can use this information to set up your next generation of young trees. But the important bit before you start, and before we go out anywhere and look for any seeds to collect, is where are you going to put your trees? It is really important to think about that before you start, because horse chestnuts are really easy to grow. But if you haven't got a location for 20, 30, 50 horse chestnuts that you might be able to grow in your garden, you're going to get disappointed at some point. So think about where you're going to put your young trees, and then think about what tree you would like, and go out into the countryside and collect the right one, so that you're growing the tree for the project that you're doing or for the place that you want to put it. And then when you're out there, you need to think about the act of collecting the seeds. Now, we have to do the health and safety tips. It's really not a good idea to climb trees. So collect from the ground. You can collect a whole range of seed. Everything on this table that we will talk about in a minute was collected from the ground with my feet stood firmly. You can pick them off the tree gently, but you should never pick all of them because there are other things that need seed. Wildlife needs it. So take a little bit of the species because you can get many of them to grow. And our job is to help nature, not to get a few more trees, not to cause problems for other things. The other way of picking them is to get them off the ground, but you do just have to be a bit careful then because they can fall in all sorts of things on the ground. So just make sure if you're picking them off the ground, you wash your hands afterwards and then pop them in a paper bag. Collecting is easiest if you pop them in a paper bag because they don't sweat, the seeds don't go off, they don't spoil. Collect them in a paper bag, take them home, and then you're ready for the next part of the process, which is about how we turn that seed into a young tree. The final part of the equation is what to expect when you go out. Just because you have an oak tree in your garden does not mean that you're going to get acorns every year. Just because you've got a rowan does not mean you're going to get rowans. In the spring, what happens in the autumn is a function of what's happened in the spring. And if you get a spring frost or the bees come out too early and the flowers aren't ready, you can have a complete failure of the flowers to be pollinated. As has happened many times with things like blackthorn that just comes out too early and then gets a late spring frost. The other thing that can happen is in some trees like oak, you get mast years. Now, mast years are where the trees it's a boom and bust strategy. They suddenly produce thousands of seeds in 1 year. And last year, 2020, was a phenomenal year for oak, with millions of acorns being produced across the country. And the theory is that what the trees are doing is they're producing so many that there is not a chance that animals will have eaten everything. Something will have escaped being eaten. And the advantage that has for the tree is it ensures it spreads its seed. But the year after a mast year, there is almost none. And this year, 2021, there is almost, I haven't been able to find a single acorn going out to have a look. It's perfectly natural. It's part of the process. It follows a mast year. But if you wanted to start growing acorns, oak trees this year, you're not going to find them. So knowing what to expect is important, and don't assume you will always find all the seeds that you're after. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the table, and we're going to talk about some of these seeds on the table and how we process them. So Julia, over to you.
Brilliant. So shall we start processing nuts? What do we do with the nuts?
Yes, so obviously nuts come in a range of sizes and shapes, and these are conkers. And so what you need to do is to work out which of these are going to germinate, which are going to produce your next generation of trees. And the simple technique we've come up with for doing that is to get a bowl of water. And if you get a bowl of water and you drop in your seeds, you will see that most of them sink. And anything that sinks is perfect. But here are 2 beech nuts, and these have come out of a beech, one of these little beech cups that happen. So inside of the seeds, and these 2 beech nuts look identical to each other. But if I float them in the water, one has sunk and one floats. And the floating one has gone, will not germinate. It is not a true seed. And so the best thing to do is to take these and throw them away. And sometimes you can have absolute huge numbers. We had once where we had 1,000 acorns and nearly 900 of them in the bucket floated. So it's about finding the ones that sink.
Okay, brilliant. Nuts are nice and easy. So shall we move on to processing the berries next?
Well, berries are a tiny bit harder because the berries come with some fruit on. And the purpose of the fruit is so that the berry will be dispersed. The bird will eat it and fly away. It will then strip from the seed. Inside here is the seed. It will strip from the seed with its gut acids. It will take away the fruit because it's eaten it. And then the seed comes out the other end of the bird, comes with a little bit of fertilizer to get it started, and is probably somewhere away from the parent. And that's what the tree wants to happen. Obviously, we don't suggest you eat these. So the best other strategy is to get the same bowl of water or a different bowl of water and a potato masher. And then with the berries, just mash them. And what happens, it's always surprising what happens. Suddenly the little seeds that are contained within the berries float to the surface. And in fleshy fruits, the seeds often do float. And here on the surface, there are 3 or 4 that have already appeared. And these little tiny seeds, little tiny dark seeds. And that's what comes out of the berry. And that's the bit that we need to be able to move to the next bit of the process. That's the bit where we stratify. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it works with all sorts. And this is one we prepared earlier. This is some damsons that I had. We made damson jam with from the weekend. Once you've made the jam, as long as you haven't boiled these, the centers of the damsons are equally good. And you can mash these to get out, just as I did before, get the fruit off. It's really difficult when they're fresh, but when they've been soaking in water for a couple of days, you can then give them a good mash, and you will get to the seeds within the damsons. You have to get the fruit, the flesh off, and sometimes it just doesn't want to, as it hasn't now. But if you can get to the seed within, get as much of the fruit off as possible, wash it, clean it, and there we go. There is a perfectly lovely damson seed that will produce your next generation of damsons. So that's how you do berries.
So does the fruit of the berry usually inhibit germination then? Is that why
it does? There are chemicals around the outside of it that stop it from growing. And in fact, it's quite sensible. The tree doesn't want to appear too early, so it has the fruit on there. Either it's stored by a mammal, rots down over the winter, gets eaten, and that gives it the capacity to appear in the spring. And they often need to get cold as well. So you need a bit of winter that happens to get the seeds to germinate.
Okay, brilliant. So we've done our nuts and we've done our berries. Let's do winged seeds next. Okay,
winged seeds are relatively easy. So these are winged seeds. So here's your sycamore. field maples and ash that we talked about earlier. Ash is a single-bladed seed, whereas the sycamores are two. And what you need to do is quite simply to break them, and you split them in half, as I've just done there, and break off the wing. This is the seed contained within, and that's the bit you want to get into the soil. So once you've broken off the wings, split them in half, then you can store them ready for the next part of the process, which is the stratification. But usually you do it within an hour. So you do this and then you stratify them. Depends how you're doing it. But some like ash, it's important also the time of year that you pick them. So when they're green, they will germinate in the next summer or next spring. When they've gone brown, they will probably take 2 years to get to a point where they will germinate.
So the wings are really just there to make it fly then? They don't need them to germinate?
Yes. And when the tree falls, the seed falls off the tree, the wings carry it, sometimes only 20, 30 meters. But I think the record for a field maple is about 4 kilometers. So if the wind gets right, it can helicopter for quite long distances.
Brilliant. Okay, so the final one, how do we process the cones?
Cones. So cones, you need another highly technical piece of equipment, a paper bag. And what happens with cones is that when they're not ripe, they're sealed, they're extremely hard and they are virtually impossible to get in. That is the point. You can't break into them. So what you need to look for are cones that are starting to open, like this one. And as they start to open, the seeds will drop out. But it's impossible to break off these ones that are still closed. So the thing to do, find ones that are starting to open, put them in a paper bag, take them into the house and store them somewhere warm, airing cupboard by the fire. What will happen is the cone will expand and the seeds will drop out into the bag. And then if you're lucky and you get it right, it might take 2 or 3 months. So Christmas, there might be some seeds in there that you can shake out. But sometimes if you get it wrong, a cone like this might take years before it breaks. So you need to look for ones that are opening. And then there are some really unusual cones. So this is a noble fir. And I haven't dared do this for the last few days because once I start this, it will completely collapse. But noble firs have cones that are really, really delicate. And if I just twist this one, it will literally come apart in my hand. And suddenly you have hundreds and hundreds of little noble fir seeds. And these are the things that you're looking for. These are the seeds that you'll need. And this one is, if I do this, it'll make, but it's got a sort of spike up through the center. So this one will literally just fall apart like paper. Look at that.
Like magic.
Leaving a central spine through the middle where all the seeds have fallen off. And suddenly I have hundreds, possibly thousands of noble fir. So what you're after is once you've got your seeds, we have to move on to the next part of the process. And the next part of the process is stratification. So we've got to get these seeds through the winter. You can plant them straight in sight. So once you've put your nut in the water and you've floated it, I mean, you can just plant that in the soil and it will grow. But therefore you want to put it in the right space. You want to put it where you're aspiring for that tree to go. Or you create a tree nursery where you're growing them on for a few years. But they're not all that simple. So with some of the others, what you need to do is you need to stratify them. And what stratifying means is that you need to get them to go through the winter. So the best way of doing this is get a pot, some sort of recycled pot or something that you've got in the garden. Use about half of the pot with soil or compost, peat-free, obviously, and then find yourself some sand and some grit. And what you do is you then mix them all up. So in your pot, you've got a mixture of sand and grit and soil and compost. Mix it all around. Give it a good mix. And often, oh, I can't do this for the purposes of demonstration because it will go completely horribly wrong. But it's often easier now to tip this out onto a piece of plastic and then mix your seed in. So what you're doing is you're mixing your seed in. This is not where they will grow. This is about protecting these seeds for the winter. So you mix them in. You want a little bit of moisture in there. You need a little bit of liquid. Mix them in. Make sure they're all covered up. Make sure they're all covered. I haven't got quite enough soil for the purpose of this, but I would add some more if I was doing it properly. Add a bit on top. And this pot is then got those seeds, and we're using that to keep the seeds through the winter. The thing is that you've got to avoid them getting too dry. So you want to leave it outside. They need a bit of moisture because that's the bit that helps them to get germinating when the light changes and spring starts to happen. But particularly if you've got nuts and things in there, you might get squirrels. So you need something to protect them. So a bit of wire mesh. And if your squirrels are particularly busy, maybe a brick over the top, and that will ensure that this pot of seeds then goes through the stratification process, which is basically getting through winter. And once it's done this, what you then have to do in the spring is sift them out, and you will start to see the little seeds germinating. And once you can start to see the little germinating roots that start to appear in sort of March, you can then move those seeds and put them into a pot where you're going to grow them on. The thing is, they don't all do it after one winter. So sometimes you have a look in the spring of the first winter and nothing's happened. Well, don't panic. Leave it for another summer, leave it for another winter, and hopefully they will start to germinate in the year after. But if they haven't germinated within 2 years, then there was something wrong. Something went wrong with the processing. And so you have to start and stop and start again. So it can be a really slow process, sometimes 2 or 3 years, to get to that point where you're starting to get your young trees growing. But this stratification process will enable that to happen, and is the best way of doing it.
And why do you need the coarse material? Why do you need the sand or the granules?
Because what you don't want is you don't want the pot to get too wet. If it gets too wet, the seeds will rot in the pot over the winter. So you want it to drain, and the coarser material gives it the capacity for a bit of drainage. If it was just solid soil, it would hold winter soil all winter. And many seeds are a bit sensitive. They don't like that. So it's damp to the touch, but not saturated. And that's how you get a pot of seeds through the winter. You can gamble. You can put them straight into a pot that you're hoping to grow them in for next year. But this is a better way of ensuring that you've got more of them germinating and more of them coming up as young trees the next year.
And what do the young trees look like when they've germinated? What's the next step? So
the next step, here's one, as they used to say in Blue Peter times, here's one I prepared earlier when I was a kid. So this is a 1-year-old pot of little wild plums. So again, I made jam last year, kept all the wild plum seed, put them in a pot, stratified it through the winter, got 2 that germinated out of maybe 50 seeds, kept the others for next winter. Some of them take longer. And we've got these two little young trees that have started in this pot. And obviously you can keep them in a pot for a while, not for very long, but for a while you can grow them on. These are 1-year-old, and these hazels in this pot are 2. And you can then grow your little trees, getting them ready. I wouldn't suggest you put 1-year-old trees out into the countryside because they're often a bit sensitive, but certainly 2-year-old trees like this one, you can put in their final planting spot, or you can think about where you might keep them to grow them a bit bigger. So some of you I know might have set up a tree nursery. In a tree nursery, you can grow them on in a tree nursery, and then you can keep them for 5, 6, 7 years, and then move them to their final destination. But they don't want to be moved more than they need to. So try and minimize the stages. Put them where you want to keep them for as long as possible.
And how do you care for them when they're in the pots before you planted them out?
Well, it's like any plant that you've got in the garden or anything that you're looking after. They need, the thing that will be problematic is water. So they need water to keep them to go through the summer. Little trees like this in a pot of any sort need watering in summer, sometimes daily, just to get them through. It can become quite a labor of love to keep them going, to keep looking after them, to keep monitoring them through the summer. Which is why it's easier to put them in a seed bed or to put them, in a nursery, because then you don't have to do the watering exercise quite so regularly. And there are other ways that you can do it. You can bonsai them. I don't recommend it for all trees, but I do love growing bonsais. So you can keep some back and look after them in pots, potentially for many years. I have a yew tree over here, which I can't quite reach. That's nearly 30 years old. I've been looking after for 30 years. So I might get it and bring it on screen in a minute because I'm quite proud of that.
Take good care of it when it lasts.
Yes, it was too far away with the rain coming, so I put it somewhere safe. So it's a simple process, from identifying your seeds to collecting them, to processing them, to looking after them through the winter, to growing your young trees from seed. But it's all dependent upon where do I want to put them? Where is the destination for those trees? And where are we going to plant them? And that needs to be thought about quite carefully.
Okay, brilliant. So I think we're ready for questions now, Jon. Are you happy for that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, let's go for some questions. So the first question that we have from Sam is, can trees be grown hydroponically?
If I say I have no idea, I have no idea. I don't know. I've never tried. It's not something I've experimented with. So I honestly can't. The first question out of the bag, and I cannot answer it.
Hopefully for the next one.
Does the questioner know? Do you want to turn on the microphone for whoever asked the question? And because they may know more than I do. Or does anybody else know whether you can grow tree seeds hydroponically? I'm afraid I don't know, is the honest. Oh, somebody said yes.
Yeah, somebody said I have.
Who was that?
They work for small, delicate seeds and they need rainwater.
Okay. I'm afraid I've never tried it, so I honestly couldn't comment. Sorry that was the first one out the bag and I couldn't answer it.
Well, let's go for the next one. I'm sure this one will be okay. So this person said, squirrels have taken all the local hazelnuts before they are ready for collection. Yes. Is it worth netting some of them to get them to a viable state?
Possibly. I don't know whether the squirrels are remarkably efficient at gathering the hazelnuts. And you could net them, but it would be complicated. It's not impossible, but it would be complicated. It can be done. But of course, squirrels are really, really bad at remembering where they've put where they've buried the nuts once they've collected them. And my garden here has hazels growing around it, and the squirrels are frantically busy at the moment gathering up all of the hazelnuts. And there was literally one left when I was preparing for this. But my garden is absolutely heaving with young hazels. There are hundreds and hundreds of hazels that have been growing because the squirrels have planted them. So sometimes go with the flow and look for where the squirrels are burying the nuts, even follow the squirrels around and see if you can get them before they planted them. But also look for those young hazels that have grown 1-year-old hazels. Think about maybe if it's your land and you can do that, think about transplanting them and using them somewhere else.
Brilliant. Katie's asking about ash seeds. Is it okay to take seeds from trees that are suffering from ash dieback?
So that's a really good, was it Katie? That's a really good question, Katie. Ash dieback, as you know, is out there in the countryside. It is starting to kill a lot of trees. The statistics suggest that it's probably something like 80 to 90% of all the ash trees in the country will grow. But if we are, I'm sorry, will die. But if we are to get the next generation of ash trees, we have to have the genetic diversity of that seed. That means that the next generation of ash tree, or the next generation, will beat off the ash dieback, and we will start to get resistant trees. And I do not know. This is an ash set of ash keys. You know, that might contain 100% of seeds that are going to die of ash dieback, or it might contain 20% of seeds that are resistant or more. We just don't know. So there really is value in growing young ash trees, because if they get through the ash dieback that's in your community, then they have the potential to be that really, really vital thing, the next generation of young ash trees. But odds are most of them will die. It's also, as I said earlier, important about when you pick them. So green like these mean that they will grow within a season, but once they start to become much browner than this, they may take 2 seasons. So if you're going to do ash, do it now, do it with green seed, and assume that it might fail, but hope that you might have some of the ones that might be disease resistant, because they are going to be vital to recolonizing the countryside.
Okay, thanks, John. Ian is asking, do hornbeams count as winged seeds, and how do you deal with them?
So we've counted them as winged seeds just because they're dispersed. Again, they have little tiny, I'm not going to be able to find my winged hornbeams on my now table covered in noble fir seeds. But what you do is, again, there's a little tiny seed, little tiny small nut at the base of the flowers. Just break away the wings, gather those seeds, stratify, and see where we go from there. There's no point in trying to float those or do any other treatments. Just put them in the pot and see what happens. Really, hornbeam is one of those that you gamble a bit on, but it's worth a go because they do germinate quite well, and they produce really beautiful little trees, or big trees.
And Barbara's asking, can you put more than one seed in a pot for stratification? And if so, how many can you put in the same pot?
For stratification purposes, absolutely. I mean, there is an element of the more the merrier, just put them in, because they are not staying in here. You want lots of them in there, because you've got to try and get as few pots as possible. So 50 to 100 seeds in a pot, depending upon the species, is not daft. But remember, they're not going to stay in there. If you're thinking that you're putting them in there to stay there, then not. You would plant less in. You would stratify many less. You would put many less in a pot that you might be thinking, I'm not going to stratify this. This is it. Then you would be planting 2 or 3, and it obviously depends on the size of the seeds. I mean, you can only get a finite number of conkers in a relatively small pot. But yes, you can definitely put in more than one. It's worth trying to put in as many as you can, and then sort them out in the spring. See how many of them have germinated, and pick out the good ones to move to that potting on process. It's like any other form of gardening. You've just got to look after the baby plants and do it properly.
And Sarah's asking, is the stratification process the same for the nuts and the berries and the wing seeds and the cones?
Yes, absolutely. Completely the same. Don't worry about a different technique. Just mix them all up into that medium. There's details of a good stratification recipe on our website, so that you can get that. But it is basically half some sort of compost, as I say, peat-free compost, and then maybe a quarter gravel and a quarter sand, just mixed up, so that it drains freely, but retains a bit of water, so that it gets through the winter. Oh, I found my hornbeam. So whoever it was that asked the hornbeam question, these are the winged seeds of the hornbeam. And just in here, there's the tiny little seed that you break out. Just strip away it's basically a little tiny nut that you pull out. And because these are so light, they don't sink. So there's no point in floating them. Just plant them stick them in your stratification medium and look after them for the winter.
So Sarah Morton is asking about the next stage. What do you put in the pot at the germination stage? So once they've germinated.
So once they've germinated, so obviously you're then looking to grow your little trees. So you want a good compost or something, or the soil of the site that you're going to, mixed in with a bit of nutrients so that the seed has something to get started. Then you would plant maybe 2 or 3 in a pot. So I planted 3 in this one. And as you can see, of the 3 that I planted, 1 didn't make the summer. So I now have 2. In this one, again, I planted 3, and this one's done better. I've got 3 in this one. So I generally put 2 or 3 in a pot with a good soil compost mix. That will give the chance that, the soil needs to drain a bit, doesn't want to get too wet. Keep them moist, keep them wet through the summer. And what you're really aspiring to by the end of the first season is that there will have developed a good root mass in here. And you can see in this little bit of soil that's around these trees is held together by the roots. So it's now quite firm. The roots have stabilized the soil, and you should start to see the roots developing, healthy looking roots on the bottom of the pot. These, as you can see, are little tiny baby roots on the bottom, growing nicely. If a plant stays in a pot too long, the roots will start to spiral, and that's what you want to avoid. I'm going to take a gamble. One doesn't do this very often, so this is all going to go horribly wrong. Here we go. So again, you can see the roots have developed. They've reached the bottom of the pot. The sides of the pot haven't got a mass of roots on it. These are looking nice. And if you then wanted to plant these out, what you would do is you would gently tease apart this part of the soil. So as you can see, we're trying to gently work out where the roots are on these trees so that you pull them apart gently. It's not a vicious thing. Just tease them apart gently. Pry. And then you will get to a place where they separate. It's always very messy, but it's gardening. It's growing trees. It's getting dirty. It's the fun bit. So you will get, this one's got a root that's gone in all sorts of directions. Here we go. What is it they say? Never work with children, animals, and young baby trees. I think that's the secret. Come on, there we go. So what we have here is a tree, and you can see it's got its own bit of soil. It's got its young roots, and that's perfect now for planting out. And obviously National Tree Week is coming. That's why we promote this. This young tree is now ideal for putting out planting as part of National Tree Week, to set up that next generation of hazels. And if you've got masses of root around here and it looks white, then you've left it in the pot too long. And that's true whether you've grown it or whether it's bought from a nursery. Because if the roots have started to, we call it girdle around the pot, are growing all around the pot, then they won't spread out into the countryside when you plant it. So these are perfect roots, if you like. They are going out, they are spreading outwards, and we can then plant that and the tree will establish itself in the soil.
And Robert's asking, if you're growing the one-year-old trees, for example, a beech tree or a Japanese maple, can you leave them out during the winter, or is it best to bring them back inside when they're 1 year old?
They will. No, I mean, I can't guarantee anything. Was it Robert? I can't guarantee anything, Robert. But yes, I leave them outside. Leave them outside. You will get some that fail. I mean, it happens. That's why you do a few in a pot, so that you've got the possibilities. But all of this that we've got here is grown outdoors, is left, because what you don't want is you don't want them so tender that when you do eventually plant them out, they can't cope with living in the outside world.
And a really important one here from Paul: do you need permission before planting trees in the countryside?
Yes, you need, and technically you need, and actually you need the permission of landowners. Often you shouldn't just randomly go around grabbing seed off anybody's trees. It's always worth checking if you can collect the seed from the trees, but you definitely need permission from the landowner before you plant. And ideally you're doing it as part of a project anyway. You've thought of, as I said at the beginning, you've thought about your project, you've thought about where you want to plant your tree. You've grown it for that spot, and therefore you've got the owner's permission because they know that's coming, and you take this and you plant it in the place that you want to plant it. And it is really important. I mean, there is, guerrilla gardening exists as a concept. People have planted trees without permission for years, but there's no point because if you don't have the owner's permission, they're not vested in that tree. They won't necessarily look after it. And what you're trying to do is that all your effort you've spent growing this little tree, I want it to grow. So I want it to become a proper tree. So I'll put that somewhere where somebody will value it.
Okay, back to collecting seeds. Joe asks, how long do seeds remain viable on the tree or on the ground? For example, if I find an acorn in December, is it worth trying to grow it?
Chuck it in the bucket and then you'll know. They do desiccate, they do dry out. And if you chuck it in the bucket and it desiccates, it floats, then it wasn't any good. Chuck it in the bucket in December and it sinks, it's good, plant it. There was another part to that question, Juliette. What was the first part? How long can they last? So sometimes seed can last for many, many years. Seed can lie dormant, and I don't specifically know about all of the species, but certainly seed can lie dormant in the soil for 5 years, 10 years sometimes. And in certain ancient woodlands, seed can of all sorts of things can be viable for anything up to 100 years. So it sits there dormant, waiting, and then you get a bit of disturbance, you get a bit of more light, you get the woodland managed. And some tree seeds sit under their parents, waiting literally for the adult tree to grow, fall over, and then suddenly spring into life. So they're remarkable things. If the conditions are right, they can last for really long periods of time.
And Barbara's kind of asking a similar question. So I want to keep some conkers and acorns to plant with children at an event at the start of December. What's the best way to store them until then?
Somewhere where the squirrels won't find them, because the squirrel got onto my table last night. This was all prepared last night. The squirrels turned up overnight and started chomping away at them, and half of them had disappeared by this morning. So don't leave them where the animals can get them. Store them in a paper bag, store them in a shed or in a somewhere where they won't get too dry. It's the drying out that will destroy them. So they need to be a bit damp. Even go so far as sticking them in a stratification pot and just leave them until your event and then just wash them off. It's about keeping them as healthy and as viable as possible, and that means not letting them dry out too much.
Fee is asking, how do you know which seeds need cold? Do they all need cold? How do you know which ones do?
Most of them do. Most of them require a period of chilling to get through the winter. That can be only a couple of weeks, but assume that everything that's sort of native in the native list needs cold, because the seed needs to have a trigger that says spring is coming, and the two triggers that they require are cold and a change in light levels. So as the light starts to rise in the spring, the seeds will detect that and will start to germinate. But also, if they haven't had a cold period, that's why they might take a year or two. So give them a couple of weeks or so outside, in the cold. And some people, to help that process along, they even store them in freezers. You can actually store a lot of seed in your. It didn't go down well at home when people found large bags of seed in the bottom of the freezer. But you can put seed in the freezer, give it that chilling, which ensures that it happens, and then move on to stratification afterwards. A month in the freezer can be really quite effective.
Okay, we've only got a few more minutes. So Ian's asking, wild pears and crab apples, is it best to wait for the fruit to ripen before getting the pips out? And can you use the masher technique or just cut them open?
I would cut them open, Ian. So ordinary apple, crab apple, fundamentally the same. Apples are possibly the most complicated of all of the things, and I haven't got a knife with me, which was a mistake. So I'm not going to be able to break these open. But we do it the old-fashioned way. We'll just eat it. So what you're after is to get to the seed. Very uncivilized, but you get the idea. And within every apple, there will be anything between 6, 8, and 10 seeds. What's this one? I can't find any of this one. The thing about apple seeds, there's their little tiny things. And they will not be the same as the apple. So this apple, the seeds in this apple will not produce another of this apple, because each one of those seeds will be genetically distinct, diverse, and unique. Apples, the commercial varieties and the old varieties that you get are grafted. So what you do is you take a bit of the apple wood of the known variety, a Bramley or a Cox, and you graft it onto a branch or onto a root, and then that grows and produces you the tree of the same variety. But in here, there will be 6 to 10 genetically distinct apple seedlings, any of which could be the world's best apple. And until you grow it on, until you let it develop into a fully formed tree, you don't know. The original Bramley tree was grown by a little girl in Nottinghamshire. She was called Mary Ann Brailsford. And Mary Ann Brailsford grew from seed the original Bramley tree. And so good was it that everybody in the village came to the village and had her apples. And then a very clever man called Mr. Bramley came and took some graft wood. And Mr. Bramley collected the graft wood and produced the Bramley apple that is everywhere around the world. Every Bramley apple that's ever existed owes its origin to that one tree in that garden in Nottinghamshire, Mary Ann Brailsford's seedling. And that's the joy for me of apple seeds, is that this could be the world's best seed to produce the world's best fruit. And until you grow it on, you literally have no idea. But then when you've got it, it is the same process. You get the little tiny seeds. You can spread them. Amazingly, apple seeds grow really well. And you spread them in the pot, stratify them, spread them in a pot, maybe just under the surface in the spring, 3 or 4, 5 to a pot. And you'd be amazed at how easy it is to grow little tiny apple trees. And it's a great one for school kids and in school, because everybody has an apple, but nobody thinks that you can grow your own tree from it. The same is also true of things like lemons. Everybody has lemons with their pancakes, but nobody ever thinks about trying to grow your own lemon tree. They're all seeds. They're all in there. You've just got to think, I could do that. I'll give it a go and see what happens.
I give it a go. Okay, we've got a few more. If the flesh on the berries has started to rot, are the seeds inside still worth stratifying, or will they just not germinate?
Yeah, they're still good. What's happening is that in the absence of a bird's stomach acid, the natural process is to dissolve. They can become really quite. You see, if I squeeze this one, you can see the seeds coming out. They come out really easily, and frankly, the rottener they are, the more rotten they are. Sorry, terrible English. The easier they come out. So that's what you're trying to get. It's a bit smellier and it's a bit nastier, but actually it's a lot easier, as I demonstrated earlier with these slightly messy and quite revolting looking, but really rather good damson seeds. As the flesh decomposes, it just becomes easier to get off. So It will be a bit messy, it will be a bit smelly, but it's usually very efficient because nature has started the process for you. And then you get to a nice clean seed which you can plant out.
And just wash your hands properly after touching it.
Wash your hands properly afterwards, yes, because it can be, as you can see, everybody, it can be a bit of a dirty exercise.
So when is the best time to plant the young trees out? When they're ready, when the saplings are ready, when's the best time?
So when these young saplings are ready, it is best to plant them in the autumn. So that's why, as I said a minute ago, National Tree Week is the perfect time. You want the leaves to have come off. So usually you would plant them in the second. So you let them grow through the first summer, stratified seed comes up, grows your young tree, 1 year old, keep it for another summer, get it to 2 years old. So this is the second year of this one. And then what you would do is this, when it loses its leaves, this autumn, this National Tree Week, end of November, beginning of December, from there through till March, that's the perfect time to plant it out, because that's when they are dormant, they're asleep for the winter, and you can transfer them easily. They don't notice they wake up in a different place. You know, they go to sleep after the end of the second summer, they wake up somewhere else. They don't really notice. And so that's the best time to do it, the winter of the second year.
And do they need protection from things like squirrels?
Yes, there's a whole different masterclass we could do about tree planting, which we may think about doing for National Tree, but that's a whole different game, how you protect them, how you look after them afterwards. But for now, yes, you need to look after them. You need to think about how they're going to survive, but look at recyclable, non-plastic tree guards, because there's a whole new set of recyclable non-plastic guards out there that we're looking at how we can use those to ensure that the trees survive.
And a final question from David: can we buy the Good Seed Guide?
I think we've got a few left on the Tree Council's website, but you'll all be pleased to know that we are reprinting it. There's a new edition coming along, and if we're really lucky, we might get it ready for this Christmas, and you might get a Christmas present out of it. But if not, they'll be ready for next summer, because the first seeds that we start to get will start appearing with the cherries in about June and July, and you can start the whole process as early as June if you're starting collecting your cherries.
Brilliant, thank you, John. I think that is time up now, and there is also the Good Seed Guide in a PDF form on our website, along with a little seed guide so that you can go out and ID your trees. But thank you, John. That was great.
And thank you all for those brilliant questions, everybody. And I'm sorry that I failed on question number 1, but
you made up for it.
It was always going to be that way. And thank you all.
Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. You'll get an email with this recording and the presentation, along with your seed guide, the PDF for that. So thank you very much for joining us, and have fun gathering your seeds.